Since some of you were unable to be on the first webinar, I wanted to repeat the larger framing of these webinars. So by way of introduction, I wanted to share with you how this webinar fits into the C2C work and why I have reached out to our two presenters, Mandy Savitz-Romer and Suzanne Bouffard. As I mentioned in the first webinar, their recently published book, Ready, Willing, and Able, A Developmental Approach to College Access and Success, has been highly praised by experts in the field. Information and a review of the book are posted on the C2C online resource book. In particular, I wanted to bring their expertise to our C2C work because they, unlike other college success experts, integrate a youth development framework with college success practices. This means that while they see value in the more traditional or instrumental approach to college success initiatives that focus on providing information, academic preparation, and financial support, they see the need to also address the role that social, emotional, and cognitive development play in influencing students' college experience and whether they stay or leave. In these two webinars, Mandy and Suzanne focus on ways that peer advocates can be trained to work holistically with C2C students, so that peer advocates are doing much more than sharing information. The webinars will help you to approach this work from a developmental perspective, or name and validate work you are already doing in this way. The accompanying lessons will offer some concrete ways to incorporate this developmental framework into the training of your peer advocates. The two webinars in this series draw on research on peer processes as well as research on social and emotional skills and how those skills connect to college completion. In the first webinar, we explored the benefits of working with students to understand their identities and develop self-narratives, and then to help students develop a college-staying identity as one aspect of their overall identity. In the first webinar as well, we discussed the role that self-efficacy plays in college success. In the second webinar, Suzanne Bouffard will share theory on goal setting and ways of supporting students in setting goals that will lead to college success. She will also share strategies for helping students assess and develop their self-regulation skills. Now, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Bouffard and share a bit of background information. Suzanne Bouffard is a researcher and project manager at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she focuses on applying research on child and youth development to practice and policy. Her work has focused on social and contextual factors that support learning and educational success, including out-of-school time and youth development programs, social and emotional learning programs, and family school community partnerships. In her current role and her previous position at the Harvard Family Research Project, she has developed a specialty in communicating about these topics for practitioners through written publications and in-person professional development. She has taught at Boston University and Emerson College and has worked directly with children and youth from elementary school through college. She earned a PhD in developmental psychology from Duke University, where she was a J.B. Duke Fellow and a university scholar and won an Outstanding Dissertation Award from the American Educational Research Association. So Suzanne, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Shauna, and thank you to all of you for being here. Mandy and I are both thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with you today about a developmental approach to college success and completion. I know that some of you were able to join us on the last webinar, but for those of you who weren't, I just want to take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about where we're coming from with this developmental perspective. As Shauna mentioned, a lot of times in doing this work, there's a lot of focus on providing information and on instrumental support. And certainly, as we all know, that's a really important part of the process, and all students need to have information. But Mandy and I both feel from our experience and our review of the field that there's really been an overemphasis on information and an underemphasis on understanding who students really are as individuals and understanding where they are in their development, particularly in terms of their social and emotional development. And one of the reasons for that is that there's not a lot of focus on social and emotional development for those of us who work with young people and work with college students of various ages. Another reason is that there's a lot of standardization in the process in order to make sure that everybody has the information and the support that they need. But at the same time, we know they need to be understood as individuals and to be seen as people with distinct developmental needs and developmental places on their continuum. So where we're coming from today is making a shift toward being more developmentally aware and being a little bit more individually focused about who each student is and how we can help them on their path to college completion. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about the developmental approach overall, you'll see up on the screen a cycle. And the cycle that's represented there shows how a set of social and emotional processes work together and build on each other to support college success. Now, in our last webinar, as Shauna mentioned, we talked about the two at the top, envisioning yourself as a college graduate and believing in the ability to succeed. And we spent a lot of time talking about identity and self-concept. But these two pieces are connected to the other points on the cycle. As you follow the cycle around, you'll see that we're also paying attention to the importance of setting up certain goals, certain kinds of goals that make people most likely to succeed, and then developing the planning and self-regulation skills that they need to put those goals into action. As with any cycle, there's no clear starting or ending point here. College students need to have all of these pieces, and as you'll see at the far left of the circle, they need the chance to put the pieces together. Students of various ages can be at different places in this cycle at different times. So some may have a college-going identity and a college-staying identity, and they may even be there for all the right reasons, but they don't have the planning skills that they need to succeed. Others might be very organized and planful, but they don't necessarily know why they're there. So what this means is that our work with students should start by understanding where they're at, building on the strengths that they have, and addressing the needs that they still have. So let me give you a brief overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to start with a little bit of a review and an opportunity for questions and discussion from our previous webinar on identity and self-concept. Mandy's going to lead that section for us. We're then going to move on to talk about motivation and self-regulation. We'll start by talking about goals and motivational beliefs, particularly around how they matter to the college completion process and also how to develop them, how we as faculty members and staff and peer advocates can help them. We'll take some time at the end of that section for review of the lessons that we put together and that we sent in advance of the webinar to use with peer advocates and students and to facilitate some questions and answers. Then we'll wrap that up and we'll move on to talking about self-regulation and planning and what that looks like for college students, why it's important, and again, how all of us who are engaged in this effort can help build it. And we'll wrap up the webinar with another review of the lessons on self-regulation and another opportunity for questions and answers. So we're really hoping to have an interactive discussion today and have a couple of points in time where we can hear from you and make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page and getting their needs met. So I'm going to hand it over to Mandy to review from the previous webinar and to field some questions and some feedback from all of you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's a joy to be back, and I'm excited about the opportunity to hear if you have any questions. Following the webinar, having had a chance to maybe think about some of the concepts that were presented, and maybe even having a chance to look at the lessons and discuss them with your peer advocates. And if you have questions, certainly want to open it up for you to raise some questions and things that came up for you after the webinar. I'd like to take a moment, as Suzanne said, to just provide a very brief overview of the last webinar and sort of remind folks where we began in that cycle that Suzanne just showed you. As a point of review, our last webinar focused on the role that identity development plays in college staying beliefs and college staying actions. Certainly, we began by talking about the importance of having a college staying identity, something that I expect most of you think quite a lot about. But thinking about identity and a college staying identity in particular, we gave an overview of how identity development takes place and how the different dimensions of one's identity become the process for understanding how students take the other parts of themselves and work those parts into their college staying identity. And so we spent a good bit of the webinar talking about the roles that people play, the different dimensions of their identity that are their demographics, being members of particular groups, et cetera. But we also talked about self-concept, and in particular the role of self-efficacy. And in talking about self-concept, we wanted to demonstrate and to examine how students' belief about their abilities and how their abilities to achieve certain things plays out for them and how the self-efficacy and self-concept are developed. And so we presented a framework for thinking about identity and self-concept as college students are thinking about why they're in college and what they're doing there and how being a college student, in addition to other things in their lives, kind of fit together. So the two lessons that we presented, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at them, really focus on two different things. The first lesson, which is entitled Understanding Self as Part of a College Student Identity, was really designed to help the peer advocates understand not just the different parts of their identity, but the importance of integrating different dimensions of their identity, in that understanding what it means to be a college student and see oneself as a future college graduate, as well as other things like being a man, being an immigrant, being someone who's strong in a particular subject or not. And so the lesson is designed to really give students a chance to step back and understand the different parts that make them up, and then allow the peer advocates to see among their peers in the room the different parts of their identities that are most salient to them. So they can sort of think about the different parts that are going into how they see themselves as college students. And then the lesson that we presented, Understanding Self, is a way to sort of expose that and bring into awareness how they understand themselves, and then also help them see the different parts of others so that they can begin to think about with their C2C students all the different parts of the identities that may be important and salient to them. The second lesson, the self-images that set up success, is a lesson that we hoped would help peer advocates understand the role of self-efficacy and the role of possible selves. And to begin with self-efficacy, a concept that I think many of you probably use and know, and students even have a general idea of what it is, but giving them a chance to step back and think about how they became to feel positive self-efficacy in particular domains. And the way that we intended to do that through the activity was to give students the space to identify their assets through an asset mapping process. And by using the different domains, we offered a number of sets of domains that you could think about for organizing students' assets. We hoped that the peer advocates would have a chance to understand how they became to feel that they have a strength in a particular area, and allow students to look across and see those same things in the students in their class. And the hope was, through the discussion questions and the reflection and wrap-up, that the peer advocates would begin to think of examples and strategies for how they could engage in conversations with their C2C students about their own self-efficacy and their own future-oriented selves. And so our hope with these two lessons is we've given you, the faculty, a starting point for thinking about peer advocate training that would integrate some of the concepts that we present here at the webinars. So a brief overview of that, and I'd like to see if we have any questions for just a couple moments. So you're all unmuted at this point, and what we'd like to do is see if you have any questions about the last webinar that we did, or if you have specific questions about either of the two lessons before we move on to motivation and self-regulation.
And this is also a time if you want to share something that you tried out with the lessons. Just feel free to speak up. Again, you don't have to type your question into the chat box. Just go ahead and speak up. They're not unmuted. We're not hearing. Are they muted? No, they're unmuted. Can you all hear us? Can someone speak up and say that you can hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay. I wasn't at the last one, so I'm just waiting to hear what other people are saying.
Well, we can certainly move on and use the Q&A time later if people think of other things they'd like to ask relative to identity. So at this point, I'll shift things back over to Suzanne.
Okay, great. And you are now muted, so we will unmute you again when we get to the next Q&A section. So as Mandy said, we know that students have to first believe that college is right for them and envision themselves as capable of succeeding once they're there. But that's really not enough. We know that they also need to have the motivational dispositions to succeed and the skills they need to put those motivational dispositions and goals into action. So today we're going to focus on these two processes, motivation and self-regulation. We have two primary objectives for this part of the webinar, which you'll see up on the screen. The first is to understand why the reasons people attend college matter for persistence and success, and to talk a little bit about the fact that it's just not whether you're there, but also why. As we have that discussion, we're also going to talk about how to support the kinds of motivational beliefs that are most likely to promote success in college. Our second objective is to understand how self-regulation skills are central to success and to achieving goals, and to talk a little bit about simple ways that we can help build self-regulation and that we can help peer advocates build self-regulation through regular, ongoing interactions and practices. When we talk about motivation, we often hear people from a variety of backgrounds talk about motivating students. We hear people say, our program motivates students to do well in college, or that student just wasn't motivated and there was nothing that I could do. But if we step back for a minute and think about what does that really mean? People often talk about motivation like it's a simple binary quality. It's either something that you have or something that you don't have. You're either motivated to graduate from college or you aren't. But the truth is that motivation is a lot more complex than that. It's not just whether students want to graduate from college that matters, but also why and what they do about it. This is important because it may help to explain why some students set a goal of graduating from college, but then don't actually go on to achieve it. The other thing we sometimes hear people do is talk about motivation as if it's something that they can give to someone else. But motivation is a process that is internal and that comes from inside. Now, that being said, it's strongly influenced by the messages that we hear from others, and what that means is that all of us have a tremendous opportunity to promote motivation. But as we think about promoting it, we have to be very clear that it's a process that comes from within, that combines the goals people set, the reasons they set, and the actions they take to achieve them. So we need to engage them in their own futures rather than trying to give them something. At the heart of motivation are goals. Goals are what drive people to act, and that ranges from big long-term goals like getting a college degree to more basic everyday goals like simply doing the grocery shopping. And those smaller goals are often so ingrained that we don't think of them as goals, but they really are. They're ways that we encourage ourselves and set up an expectation for ourselves of how we're going to behave and what we're going to do. When it comes to goals, it's not just about whether and what people aim for, but why they do it. The reasons people do things affect how well they do at them, and especially how likely they are to continue with those goals and to persist at them even when they're challenging. This is true of attending college. Research from psychology suggests to us that not all reasons are equally likely to get students to a college degree. So we're going to talk today about two of the most common goals and reasons for attending college, and think about what the research from psychology tells us about how useful those motivations are. The first is earning a higher salary, and the other is going to college and graduating from college to please other people like family members and friends. So as we move forward, we're going to think about what role do those kinds of motivations play, and are they enough to ensure that students will graduate from college? This chart may look familiar to you. This chart is the main reason that many students are in college. It is a chart showing the increasing amount of money that people can make with a college degree and with a graduate degree. A lot of students have seen this chart many times, partially because guidance counselors and other adults during their high school years showed it to them often and emphasized it. In fact, we see that in many high schools, this is the primary way that educators try to help young people be motivated to go to college. And indeed, we know that earning a higher salary is a good reason to go to college, but it may not be enough on its own. The reason that we worry about money as the sole reason for a college degree is because of decades of research on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. This work was started by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, but expanded upon by many other psychologists and researchers. Intrinsic motivation refers to pursuing a goal for its inherent interest or enjoyment or satisfaction. It's something that we do for ourselves. In contrast, extrinsic motivation refers to pursuing something in order to get a reward or some kind of recognition or to avoid punishment or sanctions. So we're really doing it for someone else or something else. If we think about examples from education, an example of intrinsic motivation would be studying hard for a test because you're interested in the material. An example of extrinsic motivation would be studying hard only in order to get a good grade. Research from both laboratories and in real-world settings like schools tells us that these two kinds of motivation are very different and they're associated with different outcomes. Intrinsic motivation tends to be associated with more positive outcomes, including persisting at a task even when it gets challenging. People who are intrinsically motivated are more interested, and therefore they're more likely to stick it out, they're more likely to work hard, and they're more likely to do well in the long term, including to perform well at a task. In extrinsic motivation, people are more likely to give up, and they're more likely, especially, to give up when the rewards that they were looking for are no longer available or seem like they're no longer possible. Now think about college for a minute. If you're there solely to obtain accolades or approval from others, or solely to make more money, when those rewards are taken away, or when they seem like they're really abstract and really removed from where you are now, you won't have anything to work for anymore. And college is all about becoming independent and pursuing one's own path in life. So if students are looking for someone else to be constantly setting goals for them, or to be celebrating the attainment of their goals or rewarding the attainment of their goals, this is going to set them up for disappointment. And we're willing to bet for lack of persistence. In contrast, if students are there for their own reasons and they're clear why they're doing what they're doing, and they feel that there is an inherent value to them, they're more likely to persist even when the kinds of rewards that might have been there previously are no longer there. One of the reasons that extrinsic goals can be detrimental is that people often experience them as controlling. And people sometimes chafe at this kind of control, particularly in adolescence. And we know that the students that you work with are of varying ages, but this may be particularly important for people on the younger end, in the late adolescence stage. For students at that age group, anything controlling can sometimes backfire. And that's true of typical incentive schemes focused on money. And this is one of the reasons that we see that, for example, rewarding students for good grades with money isn't always effective. Now, let's be realistic. Not everything that students do in college is or can be intrinsically motivating. And this is where the third kind of motivation, which DC and Ryan added later to their research, comes in. And that's called internalized regulation. Internalized regulation refers to pursuing something that's not intrinsically interesting, but that will help us reach our long-term or ultimate goals. So an example would be learning something in a physics class that you know will help you in your goal of becoming a draftsperson and working at an architecture firm. Another example might be learning something in math class that would help you be a good accountant, even though being in math class itself is not inherently interesting or enjoyable. We can think of examples for all different career paths and all different courses of study. So our goal then is to help students develop a balanced set of reasons for being in college. It may include some extrinsic reasons. As we said, being in college to earn a higher salary is a good reason, but it's not enough of a reason on its own to ensure that young people will achieve their goals. They need to also have some intrinsic reasons to be there. They also need to have internalized regulation to do the kinds of things that they don't necessarily want to do or don't necessarily enjoy. And the way that we can do that is by helping them understand the connections between those things and their long-term goals. We can do this through mapping exercises and other kinds of activities, which we'll talk about later, but we can also do it more easily just through daily conversations. Again, we'll come back to that when we talk about the lessons. Now I want to take a few minutes to talk about another way of thinking about goals, which also comes from psychology. The previous research we talked about distinguished between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. This set of research distinguishes between two different types of goals people set for themselves: mastery-oriented goals and performance-oriented goals. And this work was started by Carol Dweck, and there are now many other researchers doing this work as well, but she may be the person that you are most likely to have heard of and the person who has really done the most work in this area. Mastery orientation refers to engaging in an activity for the sake of learning and experience. Performance orientation, in contrast, refers to engaging in an activity to prove one's ability, either to prove that you have ability or to try to avoid demonstrating that you don't have ability, or to avoid failure and demonstrating failure. To take an example that's not from education, Mandy and I were talking recently, and we were talking about a friend who encouraged both of us to run the Boston Marathon. And there are different ways of thinking about pursuing that goal. A mastery-oriented reason for pursuing the goal would be to increase strength and fitness. In contrast, a performance orientation towards that goal would be, for example, to impress my brother who's really athletic, or to avoid letting down my friend who wants to run it with me. We can apply those kinds of examples to education as well. So when we think about college, a mastery-oriented goal might be taking a Spanish class so that we can learn how to communicate with the clients that we might see when we go into our chosen profession like social work. In contrast, if we took the Spanish class to prove to others that we could do it, or let's say to avoid letting down a family member who's a Spanish speaker, those would be performance-oriented goals. So why do mastery and performance goals matter? They're both associated with persistence and success. But performance-oriented goals are not associated with success as much as mastery-oriented goals. When you're doing something to learn and master content, you're more likely to continue to engage with it, even if it's challenging and even if it means trying it over and over again. In research, this has been shown with young children in laboratory settings solving puzzles, to high school students, to college students. And there's also now some work being done with adults, showing that having the goal of learning makes you more likely to learn, whereas having the goal of performance makes you more likely to give up, especially when something is challenging, or especially when the people that you're trying to impress are no longer present. What this means is that people need to have ownership of their goals, and students need to have ownership of the college-going process and have their own personal reasons for being there. We've seen many students go to college without really understanding why they're there or being there for someone else, and then they end up dropping out. In some cases, we've seen those students later re-enroll in college once they figure out what it is that they really want to do and they find their own personal reasons for being there. I just wanted to illustrate this with a quote from a study by our colleague Karen Arnold. She interviewed young people to talk about college and college dropout and college persistence. And specifically, she was looking at the period of time between the spring of the end of high school and the beginning of college. This is for students who go straight to college from high school. And she was looking at the phenomenon of lack of matriculation among students who planned to enter colleges. And she interviewed young people about why they didn't go to college. And one of the students said this about some of his classmates. There's a difference between wanting to go to college and someone telling you they want you to go to college. Because when you go to college for reasons you don't know why, then you drop out because you don't know why you're there. You're going for someone else. It's like a promise you're keeping that's not yours. It's not your own promise. What we really want is for college to be students' own promise, and we want them to have ownership of their own college-going process. Now, this doesn't mean that going to college to make others proud is a bad reason. That can be a very good reason. In fact, we often see this with students from cultures that place a strong value on education and hard work. And we also often see it in immigrant families where parents have sacrificed a lot and worked very hard to help their children get an education. But even though making family members proud is a good reason, research suggests that it's not enough of a reason on its own. Again, it's about helping students develop a balance of goals. For some students, the reasons that they find that are personally meaningful and mastery-oriented might be about doing something that they find really interesting and wanting to get better at it. For others, the personal reasons might be about giving back to their community, for example, through service learning and careers in human services. We believe that peer advocates have a huge opportunity to help students understand their goals and understand why they're in college and what they want to get out of these educations, out of their educations. We also think that they have a tremendous opportunity to encourage students to think a little bit differently. These are really important conversations and questions to ask. For example, questions about what are you getting out of being here now? What do you hope to get out of this in your future? And the most important thing here is that it's not too late to help students develop or see mastery-oriented and intrinsic reasons for being in college. Even if they come to us with very extrinsic and or very performance-oriented goals, it's not too late to help them develop a more balanced set of goals. So one of the ways that we can help students develop intrinsic motivation and mastery orientation is to simply talk with them about their reasons for being in college and to encourage them to develop personal reasons for being there. But there are other things that we can do as well. One is to provide opportunities for students to explore their interests. We often find that students in college haven't necessarily had the opportunity to really think about and explore the kinds of things that they're interested in and that they might want to do before they come to college. So it's important for peer advocates, for example, to help them find opportunities like internships, meetings, counseling sessions, other kinds of ways to learn about the options that are available to them. Another way that we can encourage these kinds of goals is to emphasize learning for its own sake and for long-term goals. And that's something that faculty can do, and that's something that peer advocates can do, and it's also something that friends can do for one another. So of course, there's always performance in the process of getting a college degree, and there are always grades and there are always exams. But at the same time, we can all encourage connecting the material to real life, connecting it to future careers, and focusing on learning. Another thing that we can do is provide opportunities for choice and autonomy, because the research tells us that people are more likely to be intrinsically motivated when they feel that they're in control and when they feel that they have choices. When they feel that somebody else is making all the decisions for them, they're much more likely to be extrinsically focused. So it's important to give students choices about their educational paths, also to help them navigate that. But we'll talk a little bit in a little bit about balancing freedom with support in order to promote self-regulation. And the last thing I want to talk about that we can do to promote mastery orientation in particular is to send the message that success is controllable and to send the message that intelligence can be increased over time. Carol Dweck, who did the original research on performance and mastery orientation, has found that one of the main things that makes people likely to set mastery-oriented goals is how they think about intelligence. So she's found that people who think intelligence is incremental and can be increased are much more likely to be mastery-oriented. In contrast, people who think that intelligence is a fixed entity that can't be changed tend to be more performance-oriented. The reasons for that, she believes, are one of two reasons. One is that people who believe that intelligence is a fixed quantity either want to prove that they have it, or because they feel like it's hopeless to try something because they don't have it. Now, what's really interesting about this research on the beliefs about intelligence is that it doesn't actually matter whether intelligence is a fixed quantity or not. What matters is what people think about it. And it's possible to change people's beliefs about that. Carol Dweck and her colleagues have done some intervention work with middle school students, and now there's some really interesting work happening in colleges as well to teach this belief that intelligence can be increased over time. And the results are showing that the people who learn that theory about intelligence are more likely to be mastery-oriented, more likely to set challenging goals, more likely to persist at their goals, and more likely to succeed in a variety of ways. Now, intervention programs are great, but we can also promote this kind of belief in everyday interactions. I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to hand it over to Mandy to talk a little bit about the lesson that we've put together to help you work with peer advocates around motivation and goal setting. After she does a little bit of a review of the lesson, we're going to unmute you all and take questions and feedback and thoughts about the lessons.
Thank you, Suzanne. So with that very substantial and I'd say comprehensive overview on motivation, I just would like to call your attention to the lesson that we've developed to support many of the concepts, although not all that Suzanne introduced. And so our intention here was not to create a lesson that would address all of the things that Suzanne just presented on, but to focus on one thing in particular. And so the lesson that you have called Goals That Get to Graduation is really a lesson that will teach peer advocates about the differences between extrinsic, intrinsic motivation, as well as the internalized regulation. And the goal here is to allow the peer advocates to understand the distinctions and their importance in college staying, something that may not be central to their current awareness. And so we've put together a brief lesson that uses this broader lens. And to accomplish this, the lesson focuses on asking students to reflect on a range of tasks and behaviors that they do in their everyday lives, and then ask them to consider why they do them. The goal here is to demonstrate the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and internalized regulation so that they can then use those distinctions to look at the reasons for college going. So that once the students have grasped the basic concept, then the instructor or facilitator can turn the conversation to the reasons that people go to college and the reasons they stay in college. This shift, we hope, will allow students to gain a greater understanding of the range of reasons behind people's college going and staying. And so while one student might be there because it's important to his or her family, that student might learn about all the other reasons that other students are in college and help bring into awareness for them the ways in which those reasons might matter or might not. We hope that by introducing this concept and the importance of finding that balance that Suzanne spoke of just a bit ago will help them think about how their conversations with students and with their C2C students can incorporate some of these ideas. So they can engage in conversations with their C2C students about the reasons why behind their own college decisions, right, the reasons why behind majors, so that when students come and they have chosen a particular major, having the idea and the concepts behind why students do certain things will allow them to have a deeper discussion, we hope, with the C2C students. And so in the lesson, you'll see there's a very basic way of having students sort of map out how they spent the last 3 days, asking them to identify the kinds of things they've done, the academic things, the social things, and then ask them to reflect on whether those things were driven by intrinsic, extrinsic things, or if it's an internalized regulation whereby the students are doing them because of the things that they will lead to. And so our hope is that in this activity, students can then shift in the discussion questions to engaged in why college going and staying might be driven by a variety of factors. And what we hope happens in all of these lessons, and I certainly could have mentioned this earlier but would emphasize here, is we really want the peer advocates to have a moment to step back and engage in a sort of process of I used to think and now I think, so that they have new information and sort of allow them to think about, with this new developmental awareness, how will they interact differently with their C2C students. So with that, I'll pause and open it up for questions.
Okay, you should be unmuted.
Okay. That's fine.
You're all unmuted. Does anyone have a question or a thought or previous experiences to share? Right, and if you prefer, you can also type into the chat window if you prefer not to speak.
Well, just to get the ball rolling, I'll start off with a question. I'm just wondering how we might be able to engage in this work, how I can make sure I'm not hand-holding but still supporting students to meet their requirements.
Yeah.
That's a great question. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we present about self-regulation. So we'll come back to that one.
Okay.
I just want to remind you all that you're unmuted, so we can hear background noise. Maybe we should move on to talking about self-regulation. And when we take our questions and answers, we can think a little bit about the connections between motivation and self-regulation. Sound good? Okay, great. So we'll put you all back on mute.
In this instance, what's the best way to?
Okay. So as we move on to talking about self-regulation, let's start by revisiting the cycle of social and emotional skills in the college-going process that I mentioned at the beginning. So now we know that students need to see themselves as right for and capable of graduating from college, and also to have a balanced set of reasons and goals. So what else do they need? They need to be able to put their goals into action. And to do this, they need self-regulation skills. To give you a technical definition, self-regulation refers to the ability to manage thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in the service of attaining goals. Essentially, to do what it is emotionally, cognitively, and socially that we need to do to get where we want to go. Self-regulation encompasses a pretty broad set of skills. The ones that I've put up here on the slide are those that we see as being particularly relevant to college going and college persistence and college success. Attention and focus, the ability to be cognitively flexible and to shift plans when necessary. Planning, organizational skills, being able to reflect and reassess and make mid-course corrections and do things differently when needed, and the ability to delay gratification in order to reach long-term goals, even when they seem really far away. Students who have strong self-regulatory behaviors are the masters of their own destinies because they're the masters of their own behavior. Being in control in this way includes having an active influence over their environments, even as those environments are having an influence on them. Self-regulation is what allows us to be in control, to be in the driver's seat of our lives. So you can see the driver here. This driver is in the picture is in the front part of the brain because self-regulation is associated with the part of the brain that's called the prefrontal cortex. Now, one of the reasons I mention this is because we're learning a lot from brain science about how different skills develop at different points in time. And self-regulation and the prefrontal cortex with which it's associated develop over the lifespan. It begins to develop pretty rapidly in early childhood, but it develops all the way into adulthood. And what that means is that self-regulation skills can and should be continually developed even when we are working with students of various ages in college. Now, it will not come as a surprise to you that the list of self-regulation skills that I put up a few minutes ago are needed for success in college. But let's talk for a little bit about how and why those skills matter. Obviously, they matter for academic achievement because you need to have planning skills, you need to have memory, you need to be organized in order to do well in your courses. But there are other reasons that self-regulation matters for college persistence and college success. One of those is because it allows for organizational skills that help with all the administrative parts of the process, choosing courses, managing deadlines, being assertive, meeting with professors and other faculty members, etc. Self-regulation also helps people establish routes to their goals, which we just previously talked about, that are clear and specific, but are also flexible. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is that if people get too stuck in a certain way of achieving a goal and the route becomes blocked, that can cause them problems and can cause them to drop out. Too often, we think that students should already possess all of the self-regulation skills that they need when we meet them. This is simply not the case, in part because of what I mentioned before about the continued development in the brain, but also in part because a lot of students have not been well prepared before they come to college in those skills. The good news is that there are things we can do to help students build their self-regulation. Even though self-regulation is about self-control and self-management, it really develops through the support of others and the scaffolding and structures and guidance that other people provide. So the goal of faculty and peer advocates alike is to help students in developing their own planning skills and their own self-regulation skills. One of the things that's important is helping students learn to take agency. Some research studies find that students who drop out of college report that their teachers and other adults in high school did too much hand-holding and that they weren't prepared when they got to college for how to take responsibility for their own deadlines, their own choices, their own study behaviors, and their own lives. We all know that the ability to make those kinds of plans and engage in those kinds of organizational behaviors is central to the college-going process. So take, for example, the need to develop plans for achieving a passing grade on a test. Appropriate strategies could include reviewing class readings, meeting with the professor, organizing study groups, or taking practice tests. Peers and peer advocates are particularly well positioned to help students develop those kinds of things because they can provide encouragement in a way that's seen as helpful and supportive and understanding rather than being seen as top-down and controlling as it might be from a faculty member or from another administrator. And in that way, they can help students to have autonomy and to take agency for their own paths, but also to provide the support that will allow them to do that. Another way that we can help is by encouraging simple organizational and self-regulatory strategies like time management, finding and using help, including the kinds of support offices that are available on many campuses, and having reasonable expectations about what it's possible to achieve in a certain amount of time. Again, those are things that peer advocates are particularly well positioned to do. Another way to help students develop self-regulation is to help them plan for and overcome obstacles. If any of the strategies that they've developed for being successful become ineffective, a student needs to be able to shift gears and use an alternative strategy. But without the ability to think and operate flexibly, students are often left without a plan when their original one fails to work out. So one of our goals is to help them develop multiple pathways. One way to do that is through a process called mental contrasting, in which people envision the future, including both their goals and the challenges that they need to address in order to get there. Mental contrasting was developed by a researcher named Gabrielle Oettingen, and it involves envisioning future goals in the context of current realities, meaning envisioning both the positive and potentially negative sides of their situations and of their goals. This allows people to be realistic and planful about potential obstacles and to identify strategies for overcoming the obstacles even before the obstacles actually materialize. So it's about finding a balance between positive routes to goals and the potential challenges that are important. What we don't want is for students to dwell on the potential negative outcomes. So we don't want to be overly focused on barriers and make it look like we're putting up barriers to getting a college degree. What we do want is for them to understand that it may not necessarily be smooth sailing from the beginning to the end, and to send the message that it is possible for them to overcome those obstacles, especially if they have plans ahead of time for how to do that. Another way that we can promote self-regulation is through promoting reflection. And the cycle of self-regulated learning is one helpful model for thinking about how to help students be reflective and to make mid-course corrections if necessary. It involves 3 primary phases. The first phase is called forethought, and that involves goal setting and planning. So a student establishes a goal, let's say, of becoming a nurse, and signs up for the required first-year courses. The second phase is called performance control, and that involves observing one's own behaviors while engaging in the goal-oriented strategies. So while studying for the first test, the nursing student makes note of the areas he's struggling with and makes a plan to attend the professor's office hours to talk about that information so that he can be proactive. The third phase of the cycle is self-reflection, and that involves evaluating the experience and making judgments about what worked and what didn't. So after taking the test and getting the results, the nursing student thinks about what his study strategies were, how well they worked, and maybe makes a plan for studying differently next time in order to have a more positive outcome. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview here of the lesson that we've put together to help promote self-regulation skills. And then again, we'll kind of unmute you all and we can have a little discussion about it and take questions and answers. The activity that we've created to promote self-regulation is about mental contrasting. So we just talked a little bit about what that process means. And here's a way that you can help students to do it. You and your peer advocates, of course. You can list one concrete educational sub-goal on a piece of paper at the far right. So one of the things that we want to do is help students to see not just what their big long-term goals are, but also to think about what are the sub-goals that they need to achieve in order to get there. So graduating from college can be a very long process, and it's very helpful to kind of chunk that into smaller goals. Those goals could be everything from passing a course to getting an internship to moving on to the next phase of the educational process for that career that's been chosen. So setting up what those sub-goals are can help the process to not feel quite so long and to help students feel like they're making progress. So what you want to do in this activity is have students pick one of those sub-goals and list that goal at the far right of a piece of paper. That goal might be something like passing chemistry class or completing all the requirements for the nursing degree. The next thing to do is to have students identify 1 to 3 potential obstacles that might get in the way of that goal and list them down the left-hand side of the paper. Now here's the most important part. For each one of those potential obstacles, the student then creates a specific strategy for overcoming that obstacle and lists it on the paper. There are lots of ways to do this. One easy way to do it is to list it as an if-then statement. So for example, if the chemistry class that I need to get certified in my chosen career is not offered next semester, then I'll speak to my advisor about substituting another course for that requirement. They should be positive, action-oriented, specific actions that students can take to overcome obstacles. So that's the most important part. Then the next piece of this activity would be to talk through those things and to help students understand that they are in control, they are in the driver's seat, and there are things that they can do as obstacles arise. One of the benefits of doing this kind of activity is it gets them thinking in a positive way about the fact that a barrier is not necessarily the be-all, end-all, and that there are things they can do, so that even when unanticipated obstacles come up, they're in the habit of thinking this way, thinking constructively, flexibly, and positively about what they can do. We've also listed here in the lesson a group of discussion questions that you can facilitate with peer advocates, and that peer advocates can then facilitate with their C2C students. Some of the questions that we've listed here are about assessing your self-regulation skills and discovering what are the skills that you need more help on. Some of them are about thinking about the long-term process of college and thinking about delaying gratification and trying to create some immediate reasons and immediate things to connect to, even in the face of a long-term goal, in order to stay with the process of organizing and planning and being regulated, even when the ultimate goal seems really far away. When we talked about help seeking, and one of the other reflection questions that we've included here is to think about what are the kinds of resources that are available on your campus to help with study skills, to help with finding jobs and internships, and to help with planning for the future. Again, as I said before, we think that the peer advocates are particularly well positioned to help students find and utilize those kinds of resources. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to unmute you all again, and we will have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the lesson, or to talk about your experiences, or to talk about your questions, and we'll hopefully have some answers for you.
And I just want to encourage everyone that this is also a time just to share your reactions as well. Is this new information for you? Are these ideas that you've heard of before? How is this, or is this not helpful to you? And maybe also to think about how you might be able to integrate some of these ideas into the training of your peer advocates who will then be working with the C2C students in ways that you may have not done before, or in deeper ways if you're already doing this work. So if you want to just share any of those ideas, that would be great.
This is Sarah from TCC, and I teach an SLS College Success course, and we actually have a whole entire chapter that talks about the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So I really agree. It's really in line with my course content, and it helps with persistence if they can really actually get into it. And so I think this has been great.
That's clear. Would you be willing to share with us what the reaction from students is? Is this new to them? You know, do you find that a lot of them are there initially for extrinsic reasons?
The terminology is new to them because we also talk about locus of control when we teach that chapter. But when we start putting it in a practical sense and giving examples, they get the concept. But the hardest thing for me in the transition, and we teach a lot of things in that class, but I tell them if you can get this chapter, you can be successful in college and in life. And so I try to just help them look at the value of being motivated by themselves. I'll even tell them if you don't know why you're in school, take a semester off. And then because when I tie it to the personal side of it and they get that it really is about them, then that's when they seem to respond.
That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that.
This is Joanne from Green River, and what I found valuable about this webinar is having the common terms that both me and my colleague can use when we are planning activities and exercises for our peer advocates. So this is not all new information to us, but it's helpful to have this common terminology. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Mandy and I often find in all kinds of settings that sometimes that's half the battle, is that we think we're talking about different things with our colleagues when we're actually all talking about the same things.
For me, I thought the information, it correlates with our SLS courses also. What I found interesting about it, it wasn't new information, but with all the research that you brought with it, I thought that that made it more of a unique presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, what?
Maybe I'll chime in with a question. I know on the last webinar, a question came up about this work requiring a lot of time to develop. So, excuse me, it sounds like a lot of you are doing context of an SLS course, sort of college success course. But if you have limited time to work on some of these motivation and goal setting issues, what are some ways you might suggest approaching the work with limited time?
Well, this is Mandy. I'm just going to offer something here. We get asked this question a lot by people who coordinate programs and say, sometimes I see a student for 5 or 10 minutes, and it's hard for me to think about teaching these kinds of self-regulation skills in the 5 or 10 minutes. And one of the things that we have suggested to people in those cases is to think about how the conversations in those 10 minutes go, particularly when it involves a student following up on a particular task. So, for example, if you are helping a student who's interested in transferring, or the mentor is interested in a student transferring, and they're working on their applications, and they come to meet you and they haven't done the part of the task that you've asked them to do, the conversation can take on a focus that really is about reflecting on what strategies they use to accomplish that task and whether or not those strategies work for them. So pulling on the piece of the self-regulated cycle that Suzanne introduced, and think about within those couple minutes how that conversation shifts from, well, you really need to get this done, it's really important that you complete this form or that you finish this essay, to, okay, what strategies did you use? When did you try to work on it? What spaces did you go to try to work on it? Who did you ask when you came up with questions? Which of those strategies was useful and effective? And what other ones could you try? Then what you're doing is helping to develop a very positive habit or pattern for how they accomplish specific tasks. And so that's one way to think about this not being about teaching a lesson, although I think the example that someone gave about a chapter on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is incredibly important. But we can back up those larger sort of programmatic strategies with just everyday conversations that model these kinds of skills as well. The other recommendation is when you are teaching these skills courses, this college SLS courses, about how you structure the lesson in a way that will build on that reflective model, so that you might begin all of your lessons with planning and performance control and then ending with reflection, and asking students as part of the class on how things went for them and what they'd like to do differently. Any number of activities that you might do or assignments that you might be giving them.
I just want to also refer back to a question previously about, how do you provide support without doing too much hand-holding? And I think the kinds of things that Mandy just talked about are key to that process. So it's about helping students get into the habit of being reflective and of thinking in those ways, sort of, why did this happen? What did I do to achieve my goal? Where did I go? Who did I talk to? And providing those kinds of scaffolds to think in that way. We've often seen that after you do that a few times, you'll start to hear that kind of language that students are using themselves. There are also all kinds of sort of structured ways you can do that with kind of a cheat sheet of discussion questions, planners, kind of very concrete tools that can help students to get into those kinds of habits themselves. Yeah.
I had another suggestion. I think, because I imagine this question may be also for people that don't teach SLS, maybe there's the idea of, although I know we like to do all of the areas, taking one area and then just theming it into your assignment. So you create assignments that will naturally bring out an intrinsic or extrinsic motivation just through the work of the assignment, and then you can reflect on it as the curriculum already.
That's a great idea, and finding a place to start with this work is really key. We know that if you think about a developmental approach in general, it's difficult to address all of these things, identity, intrinsic motivation, mastery orientation, self-regulation, all at once. And so some of this is really about understanding where your particular group of students is at and what they need the most. So your idea of picking something for a lesson or a group of lessons is an excellent way to do it. Also, on a personal level, one of the things that we often encourage practitioners at all levels to do is to say, well, what do I, as an educator, need to work on? So let's say, for example, you realize that you have been sending a lot of messages about the importance of grades and performance, then setting a personal goal for yourself of reinforcing messages about learning. For example, doing that before you hand out an exam and doing it when you hand back the results of the exam, and really kind of connecting that to people's personal reasons for being in college might be a personal goal that you can continue to work on.
Do people have any questions about the lessons? Will be helpful in terms of implementing them. All right, then I guess we will close for the day. I wanted to thank you for making the time for the webinar, and I really hope that you've come away with some concrete ideas for training your peer advocates to work with the C2C students in a holistic way. And I really want to encourage everyone to send me resources that you've developed on these topics so that I can share them out with others across the 9 campuses. I will be sending out a survey immediately after we get off the phone. So I really, really encourage you to respond to the survey. It helps us as we think about future webinars to know what we did well, what we could do differently, and better perhaps next time. So we really would appreciate you taking the time, just a couple minutes to complete the survey. And I'm being asked to remind you that we've sent out a chart that maps out each of the different programs based on different programmatic areas, and we'd ask to get your feedback on that by the end of this week. So I just wanted to remind you to send those back to Margot. We'd really appreciate that. So thanks again, and have a great day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you all, and good luck with the work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.